Spider-Man.
Okay, so to no surprise, X-Men 97 has done it again. This week's episode, Tolerance is Extinction Part 2, has blown my mind. I say this in every video, but as someone who didn't watch the original series and has been introduced to a lot of these characters for the first time, what this series is doing is just completely unprecedented. And I can't believe every single week it's getting better. I am so intrigued by this story. I am so involved and want to learn more about these characters, and this week's episode just ramped that up even more, leaving one episode left. We're gonna break down the episode. I'm gonna give my thoughts on everything, and before we do that, leave your comments down below with your theories for the grand finale of this show. It's been incredible so far. I read all of your comments. I most likely will respond. Also, subscribe to the channel because we're on the road to 1,500 subs and we're getting very close. With that out of the way, let's break this episode down. We start this episode off with the return of Charles Xavier waking up in the X-Mansion, contrasting the return of Magneto to Earth. Charles is waking up and getting out of bed, having to put the pieces back together after the X-Men brutally lost last week. He's been absent for so long, and that has taken a huge toll on the team and Earth as a whole, as we see with Magneto, who has just destroyed all magnetic fields on Earth. We see him return to his original attire, evoking that villainous sense that we know him for. And it's very interesting because now we're back at square one. These two guys, Charles Xavier and Magneto, have been going at it for what feels like centuries, and now after all of this work, after Magneto tried to be the good guy, after Charles left, they're back at square one. Meanwhile, we see Bastion walking through a town with the corpse of his Prime Sentinel mother, seeing that all of the other Prime Sentinels are now frozen and broken. This is due to Magneto destroying every electromagnetic field on Earth in the last episode, and we can only guess what the ramifications are for the rest of the world. So yes, the Prime Sentinels are gone, but the rest of the world is in chaos, and we see the humans actually hunting down mutants, particularly Jubilee and Roberto, or now Sunspot. With this, we get the triumphant return of Storm, and seeing Jubilee cry into Storm's arms was so heartbreaking, and it really lets us know that things are worse than they've ever been. We then get a very interesting scene where Cyclops is actually berating Charles about him leaving the group, asking him why in the world would he leave the X-Men and the faith of the mutants up to Magneto of all people. Charles made a big mistake, because while Eric did try to do things Charles's way, it didn't work. The whole team reunites at the broken down X-Mansion, and then they devise a plan to go capture Magneto as well as Bastion. They actually split into two different teams, one of them being the gold team and the blue team, and this is actually a reference to the comic runs that actually split the two teams as well. During this scene, we learn that Charles actually knew Bastion when he was younger and almost recruited him to be an original X-Men. And I love this because Charles Xavier is known as a very loving, caring, intelligent human being who doesn't often make mistakes, but he's making a lot here. He could have prevented all this. Bastion could have been in the original lineup of the X-Men. We see Rogue and Charles Xavier have a moment here where Rogue really is displeased with not only Charles but the X-Men overall, leading into something that happens later on in the episode. Magneto arrives and we get a great moment between him and Charles, the first one of this season, but it's actually very reminiscent of conversations that they've had hundreds of times. Like I said earlier in the video, we're back to square one. We have Magneto on one hand who wants to resort to violence and having mutants dominate everything, and then we have Charles Xavier who wants to do the peaceful route and have humans and mutants coexist. But as we've learned in the previous episodes, most people believe now that Magneto is right. And we can see that the final thing that took Magneto back over that villainous line was him losing Leech during the fall of Genosha. And Magneto makes such a good point here that some of the X-Men actually side with him and switch sides. First, we have Rogue, who just lost Gambit, and we understand why she's doing this. Secondly, we have Sunspot, or Roberto, who saw his own mother offer him up to the Prime Sentinels. So while you may not agree with what these characters are siding with, you understand why they're doing it. The team prepares to attack Bastion, and we get a lot of cool callbacks here in terms of the X-Men's history. We see one of Wolverine's old vehicles that was actually a toy released by Toy Biz, and then we see all of the original X-Men uniforms that actually get worn in this episode. We then get one of the funniest moments in this entire series where Cable sees the yellow spandex uniform that Cyclops hands him and says, "Don't you think this is a little funny?" And Cyclops replies,
"What'd you expect? Black leather?"
Which is of course a nod to the original X-Men movie where the whole team wore black leather, and Cyclops says,
"What would you prefer? Yellow spandex
A joke 20 plus years in the making, and it just made me laugh so hard seeing this. Charles Xavier meets with President Kelly in order to discuss a resolution on how to fix Earth and stop Bastion, but the US is running out of time. As they go to fight Bastion, we get a very touching moment with Storm and Jean Grey, where Storm basically thanks Jean for allowing her to see her true potential and return the powers to her. If I had one critique about this show, is that we didn't get to see too much of Storm getting her powers back and fleshing out that story. I wish there was more of it. I really loved what we got, but again, I just wish there was more. A giant battle ensues where the team has to fight off Bastion Sentinels, and we see Mr. Sinister taunt Jean Grey. Sinister was the one who cloned Jean and created Madeline Pryor, who gave birth to Cable, so this meeting was long awaited. I love this entire fight scene, especially how Sinister taunts Jean Grey by saying things like, "Would you like to know when you were switched out for your clone?" Just trying to get into her mind. And speaking of Cable, we actually find out that Mr. Sinister planted one of his stones inside of Cable and takes control of him at this moment to make him fight his own mother, or kind of his mother. He actually uses his telekinetic abilities that he inherited. And then something crazy happens. We hear Jean talk to Scott through telepathy and tells him that she loves her, and we don't know what happens to Cable and Jean. Did they die? What happened? I have no idea. If you guys have theories, leave the comments down below. So that's the first crazy thing that happens, and it only ramps up from here. While fighting Magneto, the team is trying desperately to get his helmet off of him so Charles can take control. But Charles has never done this, and Charles has always tried to find the good in people, so when they get Magneto's helmet off and Charles starts to take over his mind, Scott stops him, completely pulling a Star-Lord from Infinity War when he prevents the group from taking down Thanos. It's a very similar situation. And this is terrible because then Magneto uses his own helmet and puts it on Charles so he can't use his powers at all. The team has essentially lost until Wolverine actually puts his claws through Magneto. I was shocked. I had no idea that Wolverine was going to try to kill Magneto, and it looked like that was what was going to happen. Only Magneto uses his powers, pulls Wolverine out of himself, and then proceeds to rip all of the adamantium metal out of Wolverine. And the most brutal looking scene that is actually a reference to an actual comic panel where this happens, making me believe that they're going to be pulling from certain elements in the future in the finale and maybe even the next season, which will possibly lead to a character known as Onslaught. In basic terms, Onslaught is the melding and the combination of Charles Xavier and Magneto, the powers of Magneto with the mind of Charles Xavier, possibly being controlled by Bastion. And after we see the adamantium ripped out of Wolverine, the episode ends. A perfect cliffhanger that we're going to get resolution on in just a week's time for the actual series finale. This is how you do it. This is how you get people invested in your stories, your characters, and make them worried about what's going to happen to them. Because while yes, there are so many threads that are still left open in terms of characters and storylines from this season, I think they can pull it off. They've done it so great so far. What's one more episode? And we're in for a crazy episode where we have two villains, Magneto again, as well as Bastion. And while I don't think Wolverine is dead, he no longer has his adamantium, I don't see him returning to the team in the finale. I've heard many other people suggest that Wolverine is now going to go on the same path that he did in the comics and go on his own for a while, which hey, if we can get a Wolverine animated show, please give it to me. But this is the most excited I've been for a finale for a Marvel show since Loki, and I know that's not that long ago, but this is an animated show with characters that I didn't have much of a connection from before besides just the old movies. But this series is just knocking it out of the park. I want to know what you guys think. Leave your comments, like the video, subscribe to get us to 1,500 subs. I can't even believe I'm saying that, and I will see you all very, very soon.